Our topic is the devastating mental health condition known as burnout, how to recover from it and how to avoid getting burned out in the first place. My guest is Dr. Jonathan Hoover, author of the book Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. Dr. Hoover is a pastor and a Regent University professor of psychology. Dr. Hoover, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you.
It's such a joy to be here with you.
So, we talk about burnout, and it's sort of a colloquial term. A lot of people think it's slang, but it's actually recognized by the World Health Organization as an actual disease. What made you get so interested in burnout, and what prompted you to write this book?
You mentioned I serve as a pastor. My dad has been the pastor of the same church here in Wichita for just under 40 years, and I joined the staff back in 2010. And the church had experienced explosive growth, and everything was going so wonderfully. And my dad had been this really respected and looked up to leader, and just seemed like everything he touched was working. And then in 2010, out of the blue, he hit this wall, and it was just an emotional and physical crisis that he experienced, and it shocked us all. All of us were like, what in the world is going on? This is the guy who's always the adult in the room. This is the guy that we always look up to ask the questions. And suddenly he was dying. He was struggling with questions about, his spiritual connection to God. And he was having all kinds of worrisome physical symptoms. And the challenge was nobody could tell us what it was he was going through. Nobody was able to give us good counsel about how to help him. Fortunately, God brought him through that, and he was able to recover. But in those days, as I was sort of just trying to keep the wheels on, I was a newly minted 29-year-old pastor preaching in my dad's place. Our church was about 4,000 on the weekend at that time. So it was like trial by fire going right into the middle of that. But I kind of promised myself, when we get through all of this, I'm going to figure out what this was. I had just started studying psychology. And as I finished, my graduate work, all through that time, I was thinking, I've got to figure out what happened to my dad, and I want to learn more about it. The interesting thing is, the more I studied it, the more I found out that this has happened to so many people, leaders especially, who just go through this season where they hit the wall. And, in the old days, they used to call it a nervous breakdown. I think you can have burnout and not quite be at the point of a nervous breakdown, but that's really what it was for my dad. And that really inspired me. And so that caused me to do tons and tons of academic research. I started researching burnout academically. And that's what I continue to do to this day at Regent and with other professors across the world, actually. But one of the things that I always wanted to do was write the book that I wish we could have given my dad in 2010 that we just couldn't find. We couldn't find a resource that had the right answers. And and if you open the front flap, you'll see we dedicated it to my dad, because it is the book that I wish we could have given him back then, and the book that I hope will be beneficial to those who are dealing with burnout. It's such a painful thing. And we wanted there to be a really well-researched, if you look back at the references section, there's a ton there, a really well-researched resource on how to deal with burnout and how to prevent it, hopefully.
And I'm glad that you brought out the fact that a lot of leaders are the ones who suffer burnout, because these are good people. These are people who try so hard and are working so hard. And these are the people that suffer from burnout. And it doesn't have to necessarily be your job that you drive to or go to. A lot of people, their job is at home, being a full-time stay-at-home mom or a caregiver. If you have a parent, God forbid, who has Alzheimer's or is just declining physically, and you're taking care, any type of a caregiver also is very much at risk of burnout. So you've got these people who are working so hard, and it's very tragic. And it does seem like more people are burned out these days too. How do you know if you're burned out? Like, what are the symptoms of burnout?
Well, I think there are symptoms physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Physically, you're going to probably have some pain that you can't explain, muscle pain especially. So you're going to have, it's very common with people who are going through burnout to have neck pain, shoulder pain, back pain, It's very common to have digestive issues, indigestion. It's very common to start to just not feel right. That's something that, as I've interviewed tons of people, that's the thing that I've heard over and over again. It's just don't feel right. But remember that pain happens in the brain. It doesn't happen in the body. And so there can be triggers that feel very physical. I feel it in my body, and yet it's really happening in my brain because my brain is just so fatigued with what I'm going through. And so, different kinds of indescript pain, but there's all kinds of things. I mean, the list is long of what you might feel physically that might be an indication that burnout is happening. But also there's some symptoms related to just your mental life. So one of the things we know about burnout is it decreases activity in the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that sits kind of right behind my eyebrows. And it's sort of the best developed part of our brain. It does some very, very complex things, complex planning. It helps kind of regulate our impulses and sort of balances out our emotions. There's a lot of wonderful things part of our brain does. When we're burned out, there's reduced activity there. So as a result, I may start to struggle with working memory. I mean, all of us walk down a hallway at some point and get halfway down the hallway and go, what was I doing? What was I going down this hallway for? That happens to all of us. But if it starts happening a lot, right, that can be a sign of burnout. Getting sort of more rigid about things have to be my way. Being a little bit sharp with people or sort of just withdrawing from people can be a sign of that. I think spiritually, if you look at Elijah, right, one of the things that for those of us who follow God, one of the things that's very common with burnout is feelings of shame and feelings of failure. I'm just not being the Christian that I need to be. And even kind of sometimes I think doubting our salvation. It was interesting to me that in my dad's darkest hours, he asked me, how do you know for sure that you're saved? And I thought, are you asking me because you're worried because he thought he was dying. I thought, are you worried you're going to die and I'm not going to be saved? So I thought maybe he was asking about my spiritual condition. But then as our conversation unfolded, I realized he was asking about his spiritual condition. And I'd never heard anybody explain the gospel as well as he had. And I thought, what is going on here? But the thing about it is there's a spiritual component. There's a spiritual component of doubt and shame and feelings of failure. Remember Elijah said, he said, I'm no better than those who came before me. And so I think those are symptoms. If you want to look at what we would consider to be the prototypical symptoms within the research, we would say there are three parts of burnout. These are Dr. Maslach's model, Dr. Christina Maslach, and she's the main burnout researcher out there. That there is emotional exhaustion, which just means I don't have anything else to give anybody anymore. I don't have any emotional energy. There's nothing in the tank. There is what she calls depersonalization, and it really is just a moving away from the person that I am. I start to withdraw from things I used to love. I withdraw from work that I used to be so engaged in. And I even start to withdraw from people that I care about, just as Elijah left his servant behind when he went into the wilderness. And then finally, there is reduced feelings of personal accomplishment, or you could just think of it as feelings of failure. I begin to view myself as a failure. And when all those three things stack up together, I don't have anything more to give you. I'm sort of pulling away from who I am as a person, and I feel like I've failed. That is what burnout looks like. And you kind of see it because you see that person just get to the point where they're totally exhausted. They seem to be isolating. And then whenever you talk to them, you hear that very negative script of self-doubt and shame and failure. And when those things are the case, it's time to start getting some help, because what we know is that burnout left unto itself can lead to a lot of other mental health concerns. Burnout is distressing enough, but we don't want it to go to an even darker place.